You don't forget the sound of your own name being butchered during a $185 million federal compliance briefing. Chuck, Austin drawled, like he'd only ever seen it written on some invoice he hadn't bothered to read. Let's not bore the room with all that regulatory mumbo-jumbo. The room chuckled. I didn't. My name's Charles Bradford, Chuck to people who've earned it, not some kid, and certainly not optional when you're dancing with the General Services Administration in a suit and a clearance badge. I'm 49, been doing federal compliance for 14 years, and before that spent 6 years in the Air Force learning what attention to detail actually means. Look, 4 years ago, under Harold Westbrook, the original CEO, I could have slapped a regulation from CFR Title 48 on the table and he'd nod, grunt, and say, if you say it's required, it's required. Harold wasn't warm. He called his vacation days revenue loss mitigation. But he knew one thing. The only thing standing between Pinnacle Federal Solutions and $1 million audit was me, a 3-ring binder, and a red pen that had seen more action than most people's entire careers. I didn't do flashy presentations. I didn't give motivational speeches. I read the clauses nobody else wanted to highlight, tracked procurement regulations down to the comma, and kept us off every government blacklist Uncle Sam ever drafted. That world ended the second Austin showed up with his startup swagger and MBA buzzwords. Austin Westbrook, Harold's only son, back from consulting at McKinsey, was suddenly VP of Operations, a job title stuffed with authority and ego, no clue where the emergency contract backups were stored, and less idea what a named personnel clause even meant. First week of Austin's reign, he declared modernization starts with mindset. Second week, he brought in a digital transformation consultant who thought Gantt charts were some kind of performance art. By week 3, he started calling compliance process police. I was told I might find more value focusing on back-end workflows, which is rich coming from someone who thought SOW stood for statement of work instead of scope of work. And I noticed it right away. The shift. No more weekly check-ins. My access to federal procurement portals downgraded pending review. Legal stopped looping me in on contract updates. Hell, I wasn't even invited to the contractor milestone dinner, the same one I'd written half the proposal language for. They sat around drinking overpriced wine while I reviewed a 30-page compliance annex on data breach protocols alone in my office, reheating leftover Chinese takeout and wondering when I became invisible. But here's the thing about being invisible. You stop being watched, get time to look closer. That's when I spotted it, the subtle differences. Updates in the procurement logs that didn't track. Federal forms filed late, retroactively. Some authorizations missing signatures entirely. I flagged it, sent it up the ladder. Heard nothing back, so I made copies, quietly, thoroughly. Labeled every page like I was prepping for a deposition instead of another ignored compliance memo. Austin, meanwhile, was basking in his own spotlight. Strutted through the office like he owned the place, which, technically, his family did. He launched a Slack channel called #FreshIdeas and suggested we replace our risk mitigation flowchart with emoji reactions. Legal tried to push back, briefly. Then they got the memo. Align or be reassigned. I wasn't scared. I was pissed off. There's a difference. Austin treated the federal contract like a pitch deck, like it needed sizzle. But contracts like ours don't want sizzle. They want acronyms, filings, personnel accountability, and proof that your background check clears higher than a senator's. Austin had no idea that removing me wasn't just a bad idea. It was a completely stupid move wrapped in arrogance and sprinkled with federal acquisition violations. Still, I stayed quiet. Not out of cowardice, out of calculation. I needed to see how far he'd push, and if he'd be dumb enough to do it in front of the one audience that mattered more than any boardroom ego trip ever could. The federal client. And wouldn't you know it, he was. Austin's big reveal came on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that smells like printer toner and bad decisions. He stood in front of the whole leadership team wearing a smug grin and a polo shirt with the company logo he'd clearly redesigned on Canva. Behind him, a slideshow flashed the title, Operation Next Level, Reimagine, Reinvent, Reduce. I'd seen better slogans on bathroom air fresheners. We're cutting legacy drag, he announced, like he was narrating a rocket launch instead of gutting a firm held together by old-school grit and government protocol. The future is agile, and agility means removing bureaucratic ballast. That word, ballast. like I was some dead weight keeping his hot air ego from floating away. Within 48 hours, the consultants arrived. These corporate types with ring lights and vague job titles. Change architect, workflow optimizer, compliance streamliner. One of them, fresh out of business school, asked me how many touch points we had with the federal client. I said roughly 7,000. It's called a contract. He blinked. But do they even read all that? I sipped my coffee and smiled. God, I hope so. Meetings started vanishing from my calendar. First, it was the strategy syncs, then vendor calls, then even the pre-audit briefings. I was told my unique skill set was being reallocated toward operational integrity, which apparently meant I was now proofreading reports nobody asked me to write. One day, I tried dialing into the milestone roadmap meeting. My access code was revoked, just a polite message from IT. Per new access protocols, this resource is not available to your role. Like hell it isn't, I thought. I built that roadmap. I was that protocol. I asked legal if there had been a reorganization. They gave me HR's extension. HR told me to stay flexible in evolving team environments. That's when I realized this wasn't a restructuring. It was an exorcism. I was being quietly erased, pixel by pixel. Still, I stayed quiet. Not because I'd rolled over, but because I'd seen guys like Austin before. When I was stationed at Andrews, they used to waltz in with buzzwords and swagger, ignoring decades of institutional memory like it was moldy paperwork. But those guys, they didn't last. They flamed out, transferred upward, or landed in think tanks writing op-eds about how the military failed to innovate. So I documented, quietly. My home scanner saw more action that month than the entire mailroom. I started triple archiving contract versions, timestamping audit trails, screen capturing redlined revisions, not for revenge, for insurance. I knew Austin's kind didn't just sink ships, they blamed the crew while lighting the matches. Then one Thursday morning, while I was cataloging Section 14.7 revisions, a new email slid into my inbox. The sender, Patricia Henley, lead program manager from GSA. Subject line, clarification. Inside, just one sentence. Will you still be attending the upcoming milestone presentation? No greeting, no signature, no CCs. Just that sentence like a loaded gun on the table. I read it 5 times. They knew something was off. Maybe they'd seen the org chart shuffle. Maybe Austin had shot his mouth off in some vision session. Maybe they'd noticed new faces flooding their inbox without proper security clearance codes. But this was them knocking politely before kicking down the door. I hovered over the reply button. I could have written a book. Could have attached the archived compliance logs, the flagged audit errors, the entire list of modernizations that violated at least 3 sections of our master service agreement. Instead, I just closed my laptop. Not out of defeat, out of restraint. Because if the client was asking whether I was attending, it meant they were already questioning him. And the last thing you do when your enemy is lighting the fuse is interrupt them. You sit back and let them forget you're still holding the matches. Look, there's a particular kind of quiet that falls right before a career implodes. Not the kind that screams or slams doors, but the kind you hear in a conference room when every executive's breathing matches the hum of the air conditioning and nobody wants to be the first to blink. That's what I was sitting in. The milestone presentation was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. sharp. Federal client, internal leads, legal, ops, risk, all present. We were streaming from 2 cities, 3 time zones, and 1 very expensive contractor portal. The kind of meeting where showing up with the wrong badge used to trigger security alerts, where I once had to stop a session because someone said classified over Zoom without encrypted credentials. I was mid-slide, Section 6, Annex F, Compliance. Milestones met. Risk mitigations in progress. On screen, a chart showing procurement audit flags, each one documented, dated, and cleared. That's when Austin leaned forward. "Sorry, just going to jump in here," he said, all charm and shark teeth. "Chuck's done a fantastic job laying the groundwork." "Really? Let's give him a round of applause for his past work." I didn't move. Nobody clapped. He smiled tighter. "That said, we're pivoting to a more agile compliance model. Less paperwork, more velocity. We think that aligns better with where federal priorities are headed, don't you?" The client didn't respond. Neither did legal. I could feel the attorney from procurement actually stop breathing. Austin turned to me like a magician finishing a trick. "Chuck, you're welcome to stay on in an advisory capacity during the transition, but as of today, we'll be going in a different direction." There it was. Fired mid-sentence in front of the client on a federally recorded call. No HR, no off-boarding packet, just a warm public thank you and the professional equivalent of getting punched in the gut. I didn't ask questions, didn't raise my voice, didn't say a damn thing. I closed my laptop. Not a slam, just a soft click that somehow echoed in the room louder than any explosion. Then I slid the USB with the full milestone packet into my briefcase, stood up, straightened my tie, and walked out without a word. Behind me, chairs creaked. You could practically hear Legal's heart attack forming in real time. Patricia Henley, the same woman I'd walked through a hurricane of audits with, who once called me from a layover in Dubai to confirm one clause in a cybersecurity addendum, remained stone-faced. Didn't blink when I was cut off, didn't flinch when I stood. But as I reached the door, I heard the scrape of her chair. She stood, said nothing, just gathered her notes, picked up her water bottle, and walked out after me. Didn't glance at Austin, didn't log off the call, just followed. We walked in silence down the hallway. I didn't ask where she was going. She didn't ask where I was headed. It felt like two people leaving a crime scene. When we reached the elevators, she pressed the button, looked straight ahead and said, "Your slide was flagged as required in our internal prep. Annex F." I nodded. It still is. The doors opened. She stepped in. I didn't. As they closed, she turned just slightly and said, "Understood." Back upstairs, Austin was probably high-fiving some consultant named Blake, already drafting a LinkedIn post about streamlining legacy structures. What he didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to grasp, was that he hadn't just cut a position. He'd severed the one name tied to the contract's compliance validity, the actual human connection holding our federal clearance in place. But I didn't rush to explain. I let the doors close, let the quiet settle. Because the fuse had been lit, and the building was still full of people who had no idea what was coming. The echo of that meeting hung in the building like the smell of burnt coffee. Bitter, wrong, impossible to ignore. By 10:07 a.m., the hallway outside the conference room was a graveyard of confusion. Austin strutted out like he'd just executed a flawless business move. "We're moving fast now," he told one of the consultants, slapping his back like they'd just closed a major deal instead of torpedoing a federally regulated contract. Old systems don't scale. Meanwhile, the rest of the leadership team sat frozen around a half-finished fruit platter and the smoking crater of a catastrophic decision. The federal client never returned to the call. No goodbye, no thanks for your time, just one chair left conspicuously empty and a login that read, "Connection lost." But everyone knew it wasn't a tech issue. People whispered. Legal held an emergency huddle behind closed doors. Procurement started cross-referencing the milestone submission schedule like they were trying to solve a murder with only a spreadsheet and a bottle of aspirin. I knew because Jennifer from Legal texted me exactly that. "What the hell just happened? You okay?" I didn't answer. Not yet. Austin was too busy to notice the tension. He was dictating his version of events to the PR rep. "We've streamlined," he said. Chuck was vital, past tense, but we're building a more flexible compliance narrative. A narrative, not a policy, not a clearance, a damn story. They were already drafting the press release, some jargon-filled garbage about forward motion, agile restructuring, and legacy optimization. None of them realized yet that the real story wasn't being written by PR. It was already being composed in the federal agency's logs. At 2:42 p.m., while Austin was still in meetings about branding the transition, I got a secure email notification on my phone. Government domain. No greeting. Just a single line. Off the record. What's your availability next month? I stared at it for a moment, sitting alone in my kitchen, coffee cold, briefcase still zipped tight beside me. That line told me everything. They knew. Not just that I'd been cut, but what it meant, what it put at risk. Austin might have been playing musical chairs with department heads and legacy titles, but the client had one thing on their mind: continuity. And I was the continuity. My name on paper, on clauses, on clearances. I was the signature that made compliance valid, the The person who could legally sign off on handling restricted data sets, who had sat through the background checks, the polygraph exams, the 3-hour quarterly audits that Austin couldn't even spell. I clicked reply, typed only one sentence, depends who still has clearance. Then I shut my laptop again. Outside, Austin was still marching forward like a guy holding a map to a building that was already on fire. He didn't understand how any of it worked, didn't understand that I was the named officer, didn't know that Clause 944 in the MSA locked certain responsibilities to specific personnel, non-transferable, non-replaceable, without written federal approval. Didn't know that the contract he just butchered, like it was a pitch deck for some startup meeting, didn't belong to the company. It belonged to me. By Friday morning, I stopped receiving internal emails. Access to the company drive, gone. Key fob, deactivated. Benefits page, your credentials are no longer valid. But I wasn't worried, because silence is only scary when you don't know what's coming. I did, and I'd already laid the groundwork. The paper trail, the logs, the archived emails, the original signed versions, the flagged compliance slips they tried to streamline into nothing. I'd backed it all up, stored in 2 places. One with my attorney, the other already in the cloud folder I'd shared with the client 6 months ago for redundancy. The kind of redundancy Austin just cut without thinking. And now it was just a matter of waiting. Let the building hum with confusion. Let Austin spin his story. Let them all wonder where the storm was coming from. Because it wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The federal client didn't send flowers. They sent a formal notice. Subject line: suspension of engagement, immediate. 3 bullet points, no fluff, no emotion, just bureaucratic steel sharpened to a razor's edge. All scheduled meetings are suspended until further notice. Outstanding invoices will not be processed pending internal review. Personnel breach under active investigation. Compliance status unresolved. I read the email on my phone from a corner booth at a quiet diner 2 blocks from DuPont Circle. My coffee had just arrived. The server offered cream. I declined. Across from me sat a recruiter from the Office of Management and Budget. We weren't strangers. We'd crossed paths during a multi-agency audit 2 years ago and bonded over the shared trauma of watching someone mislabel a data container and then argue about it for 47 minutes. She slid an NDA across the table. Just for today, she said. I didn't speak. I signed. Back at my old firm, the earth was shifting. Legal was in free fall. Procurement had gone silent. Finance was rereading every line item in the contract, trying to decode where the cracks started. And Austin. Austin was doing what guys like him always do when their reflection starts to blur. He blamed everyone else. First, it was the outdated contract structure. Then it was legal's lack of urgency. Then it was compliance's inflexibility. He paced the glass hallway like he was having a meltdown, red in the face, jabbing fingers at department heads and demanding answers he didn't understand. At one point, he stormed into legal's office, shouting, "Why didn't anyone tell me he was named on the damn thing?" Jennifer, bless her, didn't even look up from her laptop. "You said you didn't have time for the boring sections." HR tried calling me 4 times that day. Then sent an email titled, "Touching. Base would love to chat." I didn't respond. I was too busy negotiating oversight scope and remote clearance transfer clauses with my new employer. Because here's what Austin never understood. People don't leave federal contracts. They graduate from them. And while he was polishing buzzwords for his LinkedIn fan club, I was already 3 steps into the next phase. OMB didn't just want me. They wanted continuity, stability, the kind Austin couldn't manufacture, buy, or fake. They knew my clearance was intact. They knew I already spoke the government's language. They knew what it meant when a federal program manager walks out of a meeting behind a compliance officer without saying goodbye. "Once the freeze hits payroll," my recruiter said, tapping her pen against the table, "he'll figure it out." I nodded, not bothering to smile, because the freeze had already hit, and Austin was now completely alone. At 6:17 a.m., Harold Westbrook's Gulfstream touched down on the tarmac in D.C., wheels squealing like they were trying to warn him. The real CEO, the one who'd built the company with nothing but a Rolodex, a bad temper, and an ironclad respect for federal red tape, checked his phone while the engines wound down. The lock screen bloomed with red. 10 missed calls, a string of increasingly panicked texts from legal, and one chilling subject line from procurement. Urgent. Client freeze. Personnel violation confirmed. He didn't bother waiting for the jet bridge. He read through the formal notice in the car, eyes narrowing with every line. The coffee his assistant handed him stayed untouched. When he reached the end, named Officer Charles Bradford, clearance status suspended pending internal review, he let out a breath like he was about to lose his mind. By 7:03 a.m., Austin's phone rang. He didn't answer the first time, or the second. By the third, he picked up, out of breath. "Hey, Dad, listen, there's a bit of a miscommunication happening with what the hell happened?" A long pause. Austin cleared his throat. He was toxic, old school. Couldn't adapt to the new pace. Harold didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Our entire federal clearance was him," he said flatly. "Who the hell did you just fire?" Austin didn't answer. Didn't need to. Harold already knew. He ended the call, walked straight into HQ, bypassed reception, and didn't say a word to the executives lining up like kids waiting to confess which window they broke. Back in my apartment, I poured myself another cup of coffee, folded yesterday's newspaper in half, and watched the panic spill across LinkedIn in real time. First, the firm's public calendar went dark. Meetings removed, visibility restricted. Then a few sharp-eyed industry folks noticed the federal agency's name had quietly disappeared from the client list on the homepage. Then came the update from an anonymous industry blog. Top-tier Fed contractor under scrutiny after named officer removed without notification. The firm issued no statement because there was nothing to say. They'd fired the one person who held the clearance, the relationships, and the keys to the audit trail. Now the guy who called me ballast was being called something far worse by his own board. Inside the building, Harold convened an emergency roundtable. Legal, pale and sweating. Finance, borderline hysterical, worried about cash flow gaps and the domino effect of a frozen quarter. Procurement holding a printout of the original MSA with my name highlighted in 6 places. And Austin. He tried to lean back, put on that smug grin. "I was trying to bring in new blood," he offered. "We needed to innovate." "You needed to shut up and read," Harold snapped. "You fired the person whose name is the contract." Dead silence. HR tried to chime in with, "We followed offboarding protocols." Harold cut her off. "I don't care if you gave him a gold watch. You let a 31-year-old consultant tell you to delete our federal standing like it was an outdated spreadsheet." He stood slowly, picked up the binder from procurement, and walked out of the room without another word. Meanwhile, I was just finishing my coffee. Phone buzzing silently on the table with a message from my attorney. "They want to talk. I told them you're unavailable per your new contract." I turned the phone face down and opened the crossword. 5-letter word for consequence. I smiled. Karma. The fluorescent lights hummed steady, like they'd been waiting all morning just for me. I stepped through the glass doors of OMB's intake center, the kind of place that smelled like old carpet and serious authority. No front desk smiles, no receptionist pretending to be busy, just a manila folder with my name printed in black and a security officer who checked my ID twice, then handed me a visitor's lanyard without a word. Down the hall, 3rd door on the left. The room was small, windowless. 1 table, 1 chair, and 1 woman already seated. Patricia Henley. Cool as ever, her expression unreadable, posture exactly like it was the last time I saw her, when she stood up in silence and followed me out of that boardroom. She nodded once. I nodded back. She slid the badge across the table. I picked it up. Not rushed, not emotional, just right. Like the final piece of a puzzle that had been hiding under someone else's arrogance. "Your clearance is reinstated under direct portfolio control," she said. "No intermediary approval required. You'll route documentation through us going forward." I didn't smile. She didn't ask questions. I signed the line beneath the seal, initialed the clause below it. Yes, that one. The one Austin didn't read, the one that made my name the lock and the key. When I stood to leave, she added, "Issue transition guidance to the prior contractor." "Already received the notice," I said quietly. "They just don't know it yet." Back at the firm, my former firm, the scene was colder than a morgue in January. Harold sat alone in the war room, tie undone, staring at a printed copy of GSA's official freeze extension. No meetings, no payments, no access, with a bold line at the bottom. "We will reassess contract eligibility when personnel integrity has been restored." The phrase hit like a hammer. Personnel integrity. Not operational readiness, not scalability, integrity. The one thing they'd screwed up while chasing metrics and gutting experience for the sake of modernization. The firm's inboxes were silent. The contractors had gone dark. And Austin was nowhere. Rumor was he'd taken personal leave, though nobody was buying it. A guy who confused clearance with clout doesn't survive long in an industry where your reputation isn't just your currency, it's your license to operate. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed once. Message from my attorney forwarding one last internal memo. Subject: urgent strategic re-engagement planning. I didn't open it, didn't need to, because everything had already been said. In the logs they ignored, in the clauses they skimmed, in the badge now clipped quietly to my jacket. No vengeance, no press release, no dramatic email chains, just a quiet name on a line that meant everything. And a building full of people who finally realized what it meant too late. As I stepped back into the sunlight outside the OMB building, a gust of wind caught the edge of my coat. I tucked the badge beneath the lapel and kept walking. No destination, no grand plan, just a future where I'd never again have to explain what I'm worth to someone who thought power was louder than proof. The clearance stood, and so did I. 6 months later, Austin Westbrook was working at a startup in Austin, Texas, calling himself a digital transformation evangelist. Pinnacle Federal Solutions was sold to a competitor for parts. Harold retired to Florida with what was left of his reputation. And me? I was sitting in my new office, reviewing a compliance manual that would keep another contractor out of trouble, drinking better coffee and getting paid what I was actually worth. Sometimes the best revenge is just being right.